Okay, thank you everybody for joining October webinar. I'm super excited to introduce Jacob Kelter, who is actually the winner of the Best Paper Award in our last conference. And today he will talk about advanced NetLogo features. I'm going to briefly introduce Jacob. He is a PhD candidate in computer science and learning sciences at Northwestern University, where he is a member of the Center for Connected Learning and Computer-Based Modeling, which develops and maintains NetLogo. His study covers using agent-based model for learning sciences, developing curriculum, and also one of the topic that he study is the effect of land constraints on macroeconomic study, which he got the Best Paper Award last year. So without further ado, Jacob, would you like to take the floor?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for introducing me. And hello, everybody. I'm excited to present to you today some of NetLogo's more advanced features. And also, just before I start, I want to mention that so NetLogo has been in development for now officially about 25 years, unofficially a few more than that. And throughout this whole time, it's just been funded based off of my advisor getting research grants and using those to help fund NetLogo development. We just got, the NSF has a new program called Pathway to Open Source Ecosystems, POSE for short, where they're trying to figure out ways to make open source software more sustainable long-term beyond the initial research grants that fund it. So NetLogo just got one of those. And so we're planning on doing more outreach and trying to get the community more involved in developing and maintaining NetLogo in various ways to make it sustainable, hopefully into the far future. So if you're not on the NetLogo user group list and things like that, I encourage you to join those because that's where we'll be sending out information if you're interested in potentially getting involved with that. Okay, so I'm going to be switching between slides and showing NetLogo. And to start, I wanted to show a couple new features. So NetLogo 6.4, the beta we just did an internal private release of the 6.4 beta. So the public beta will be out probably in a few days, and then the full release a few weeks after that, after we've caught any bugs. And so there's a couple new things I want to just introduce from that. One is something called variable unpacking, which I'll show in a second. And the advantages of this is you can have more concise code. It's also easier to do functional programming, which maybe when I show the example, I'll describe what that means in case people don't know. So let me switch over to this other screen. So can everybody see the NetLogo window here? Great. Okay, so I've made just a little reporter here that reports a pair of random numbers. So if I just go to the command center here and type this in, I just get a list of numbers being returned. And what's new now in this new version of NetLogo is that you can unpack multiple values from a list, variables on a single line. So if you wanted to get a list of numbers and assign them to two different variables, and previously what you'd have to do is assign that pair of numbers to a variable and then get the first value and then get the second value, and then you could print those things. But in this new version, you can use set on a list with two variables inside. These X and Y are global variables here. And then X and Y will be assigned to the first and second members of that list. So this procedure here is a fake little procedure that's just getting some random numbers and printing them. But this can be very useful. And I was actually one of the people that pushed for this feature because in more advanced models, including that economics model that I presented at the conference last year, I had some procedures with a lot of logic in them. And I wanted to be able to write tests to make sure that they were doing what I wanted. But if the agents are actually assigning values to themselves inside the test, it's harder to write tests. If you have a reporter that just takes inputs and outputs and doesn't change the state of the model, it's easier to test. And that's what's known as functional programming, when a pure function doesn't change the state of anything else. It just takes inputs and gives outputs. So by default, NetLogo is not so functional in that often we're just asking agents to do things and that changes the state of everything. But so if you're trying to be able to test your code, this is really useful because you can write a procedure, have it do a whole bunch of stuff and return multiple values. And then just have on a single line, you can collect all those values and variables, and then have your turtles change their state based on those variables. So it's a kind of a little language change, but something that I'm excited about. Another new thing in NetLogo, the new NetLogo, is some improvements to BehaviorSpace. So this model that I'm showing here is in the models library. It's a virus model. And so I've made a couple BehaviorSpace experiment here. So previously in BehaviorSpace, whatever reporters you were using, in this case, I'm just reporting the number of infected people and the number of cured people, that would either get reported every step or just once at the end of the entire run. Those were the only two options. So in the latest version of NetLogo, you can actually set here conditions for when to report the metrics. So in this case, I've written a reporter here called change this tick, which just checks. So I have a global here called change this tick, and what that does is I set it to false by default at the beginning of each time through the go loop. And then anytime a turtle is either infected or recovers, then I set it equal to true. And so if there's a change in one of the turtles being infected or recovered, then that gets set to true. And so then what that means is I'm only recording data when there's an actual change in the populations of infected or recovered individuals. So this can be really useful, especially if you're doing really long model runs and lots of experiments. Then the amount of data that's going into a spreadsheet can get overwhelming. So if you're doing something like that, now you can set conditions to do something like what I'm doing, or just do it like here. They have an example. If you only want to record data every 5 ticks or every 10 ticks or whatever it is, you can set that condition here. And I'll show quickly just what that looks like, but there's a couple other things here also, which is post experiment commands. So there were and post run commands, which are now different. So now you can have commands also that run at the end of each run. So let's say your BehaviorSpace experiment is running 10 different runs. So these would run at the end of each one of those 10. And then post experiment commands just run once at the end of the entire experiment after everything has run. So these just give a little bit more flexibility in terms of running experiments. So I'll go back to my slides now. So here's an example of these graphs were created from that model. This is the original version where I'm getting data every tick. And at the end, when there's not many people infected yet, there's a bunch of time where nothing is changing, but those values are still recorded. Whereas when I was only recording when things changed, then you can see that there are gaps here where nothing changed, so there's no new data point, which may actually, in some cases, might make things trickier to analyze. So you don't necessarily want to always plot less data. Sometimes it's easier to just plot it every tick and be able to analyze that. I was just using this as an example of conditionally recording data. All right, I'm thinking I'll stop after each little section and see if there's any clarifying questions, and then I'll go on. So any questions on either of those things before I go further? Sorry, the audio. I at least can't understand.
Yeah, the audio seems quite weird. Steve, can you type your question on chat room so that we can read your question?
Okay, is this better?
Oh yeah, now it's more.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't set my microphone. Yeah, I use the time extension so that each tick is associated with a certain date, and then I keep track of whether or not the current date is the date on which we have field data to compare model results. And so I can see using this feature to only produce output on the dates when we have field data to compare the model results to. So you'll end up with an output file that's much easier to analyze.
Okay. Great. Yeah, that's a great example of how this could be used. Yeah, hi, Steve. I'm actually going to be showing a model that you helped, you submitted to the models library shortly.
Yeah, Jane and I actually just did a model where we needed to do this, and we actually ended up storing a vector, a series of vectors, things we wanted to graph. We actually made a bunch of lists of data that we then dumped at the end, which was a hack. And this is much more elegant. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about behavior search. So that was BehaviorSpace. If you're able to run experiments on and just do a parameter sweep of all your things, that's great. Behavior search, the problems that it's trying to solve is when you want to model some emergent behavior, like we're always doing, but the agent-based model only produces emergent behavior with certain parameter values, which is often the case. There's only certain parameter values that you'll get the behavior that you want, and the number of parameter combinations is huge, which is often the case. If you have just a few parameters, then when you multiply together all the combinations, there are lots and lots of combinations. So behavior search is actually a separate program, but it comes bundled with NetLogo, and it interfaces with NetLogo to search for what combinations of model parameter settings will lead to specific behavior. So for example, flocking or whatever it is. So one of the first papers that was written about this behavior search was looking for parameters that would lead to the tightest flocking. And so this diagram is from that paper. And I'm going to show a different example. And so one analogy people often use, or a way to think about what's going on, is that you can think of a fitness landscape that you're searching across. So on in this case, on the y-axis, this would be representing a measure of whatever the target behavior was. So if it's higher, that means that the outcome of that model run was high in whatever the emergent behavior is that you're looking for. And if it's low, then it didn't really have that emergent behavior. And then these other two axes would be the parameter values of two different parameters. And so as you vary those parameters, you get more of the emergent behavior or less of the emergent behavior. But often we're doing this in much more than a two-dimensional search space. But this is one way to think about what's going on in these search spaces. Okay, so how it works is you have to design a quantitative measure for the target behavior. This is often the most challenging part of the process. Then after that, you set the allowable parameter ranges, which is very similar to BehaviorSpace. You choose a search algorithm, which these ones are built into BehaviorSearch, and then you run it, and then you examine the results. So I'm going to give an example, a somewhat contrived example of the wolf-sheep predation model. So let me switch back over there. Okay, so in case anybody hasn't seen this model, probably most of you have, but this is a model built into the NetLogo models library. There's sheep, there's wolves, and there's grass, and they wander around. The sheep eat grass, and when they have enough energy, they reproduce. The wolves eat sheep when they run into them, and when they have enough energy, they reproduce, and then the grass just regrows at some rate of regrowth. And so I wanted to see I wanted to find parameters that would maximize the wolf population over time. So I'm going to open up behavior search here. So this is what the interface looks like. So there's a few different tabs here. On the model tab, you have your parameter specification. So this is basically the same as how BehaviorSpace works for each of your parameters. You specify a range. There's actually a couple other options compared to BehaviorSpace. You can have this do a continuous search instead of a discretized search. But you can look at the documentation, it's pretty much the same. Then over here, similarly also to BehaviorSpace, you have some setup commands, go commands. Usually these are just setup and go. Then you have your measure. So in this case, it's very simple. I just decided to count the wolves, but often you need to design a measure and you'll write a procedure that calculates that for your model and then outputs it here. And then you can have a condition here of when to take this measure. So in my case, I wanted to wait for the model to reach some sort of steady state. So I'm waiting for 1500 ticks. You can have a stop condition if you want, and then some limit of how many model steps. So this is the first setup. Then on your search objective, you can set either maximizing or minimizing the fitness. So you can create your measure as one that you want to either maximize or minimize. Then you can choose how to aggregate across your steps. So in my case, I played around with this for a while and it ended up being summing across the steps made the most sense. Originally I did the mean, but then what could happen is the model was stopping early when wolves would go extinct. So it would just create a big peak and then the wolves would go extinct. But because it was taking the mean, it didn't matter that it only ran for a short amount of time. So you have to think about which of these to use. And then you can have a number of how many times to run each parameter value, how to combine those replicated runs. You can take any of these options. And then you have to pick your search algorithm. And so there's 4 different options here. The default one is a standard genetic algorithm. And there's a few other options. There's some parameter values for the search algorithm that you have to set here. And there's also some different options for how the search encoding representation works. So I don't have time to go into detail of how these algorithms work, but in brief, what happens is you take all of your parameters. Let's say we have 8 parameters. So we're going to have a genome or a DNA that we're making that just by stringing together the values of those parameters. And we take a whole bunch of initially random combinations to create a bunch of different genomes. We run the model for all of those things, take the measures, see which ones did the best, and then combine and mutate the best ones into a new generation of parameter values. And that repeats until either you have some evaluation limit or maybe you have some other criteria. So once you have this all set up, then you click this run behavior search button. You can decide how many threads to run. And I'm not actually going to run this very long, but a dialogue like this pops up and it can take a while. It can take a while to run. So I'm going to cancel that, but that's what it looks like. So then once it has run, you'll get a bunch of CSV files that include a history of the best parameter settings, the final best parameter settings, model run history. So you get a few different outputs here. And just to show what happened for me here. So this is now preset to the model parameters that I found in my search. And I didn't necessarily expect that this is what would happen, but compared to the default parameters, what happened here when we're just trying to maximize wolf population, but with these parameters, we actually get this much more cyclical behavior where we get these bigger booms and busts compared to the default parameters. And it turns out that's what maximized the population of wolves over time. for the behavior based on the, so this is, yeah, so this is at the end what the dialog looks like. It'll show you the search progress and the maximum fitness over time of your model combinations. And yeah, so here's what the default settings look like with the populations, and here's what it looked like with the parameter settings that BehaviorSearch found given my objective. A couple pitfalls to be aware of. So here are just some, when I was going through this, some things that came up. So I first did count turtles instead of wolves, and that just ended up with the wolves going extinct and a really high sheep population. So that didn't work. Then I tried doing count wolves as the target, but the model run was too short. And so then the behavior I got was a huge spike of the wolf parameters that led to a huge spike in the population, but then a crash and extinction. But since that happened after the model run was over, that was still counting as maximizing the wolf population. And I also tried instead doing the variance of the turtle population, because I thought, oh, maybe I'll get a cyclical pattern there. But that also actually just led to huge spikes and then extinctions. So finding the right target can often be tricky. And yeah, I just showed this. And then a few little quirks so that I found while doing this. So one, when you double click one of these, just to be aware of, when you double click one of these BehaviorSearch files, it opens BehaviorSearch, but it doesn't actually open the file. You have to then do file open. So that's a little bug that I found while doing this. So just something to be aware of. Also, that progress dialog, for me at least, doesn't really show anything until it's done. So it is probably working even if it's not showing any progress. You just have to wait a while. And then the other thing, I'm not positive about this because I didn't wait forever. But if your target measure never changes, I think this will just run forever. So you have to make sure that your target will actually change. For me, what I was trying to do is, if you just have wolves and sheep and the grass never gets diminished, like the grass is just always there and sheep can keep eating it, the default model settings lead to extinction of the wolves. I wanted to see if there were parameter settings that could lead to a stable ecosystem. And so I ran it that way, and it just kept running and never output. And so I think it wasn't able to find any settings that led to a stable ecosystem. So yeah, something to be aware of. Make sure that your target will actually change over time. Otherwise, you might be waiting a long time. Okay, so any questions on this before I go on to the next topic, or comments?
Yeah, Jacob, do you have any experience with how complex a model you can use this with? Like if you have a model that takes a half
hour to execute, I don't think it will work very well, or it might just take you like weeks to run one of these things, because in order to work, it does need to run like at least in the range of hundreds of model runs to be able to search the space effectively. Yeah, so if it takes 30 minutes, I don't know how useful this will be.
So does BehaviorSearch parallelize the runs at all? You know, if you've got 10 cores available, will it run 10 of them at once?
Yeah, you can run 10 of them at once if you have 10 cores.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, there's nothing built in to parallelize it like across a cluster. That would be a nice project to do for people who have access to that type of computing resources. But yeah, on your personal computer, if you have 10 cores, then you could run 10 at once.
And is it using the same limitations on RAM that NetLogo as a whole uses?
By default, yes. I'm not sure if there are ways to change that within BehaviorSearch. That's something I'd have to look into. But it is running them headless, so like it does take a bit less memory when you're running a NetLogo model headless as opposed to with the graphical user interface. It takes a bit less memory. So, but yeah, by default, it's going to use the same headless settings as when you're doing BehaviorSpace. There are change the global settings for that, if not within BehaviorSearch.
Are there ways of adding other heuristics, Levenberg Marquardt? Is that like an extension approach or anything like that?
Other heuristics in terms of which search algorithms?
That's right.
Not that I know of, but I'm not an expert in behavior search, so I don't want to say definitively no. But yeah, not that I know of. But if this is something that was developed a number of years ago as part of somebody's PhD research, and I don't think many changes have been made to it in the last 5 years. If there's something you really would like to see added, you can send that to the NetLogo development team, and it might get developed. Or if you have the skills to add something, then that type of contribution is always welcome as well.
Good, thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to go on to discrete event scheduling, and Steve Railsback was on the call, was part of the development of this. So maybe I'll direct questions to him at the end. So I'm going to use an example model here of the virus model, which we already saw a version of it running. And so comparing the two different types of scheduling. So by default, NetLogo uses tick-based scheduling, which if you've used NetLogo, you're definitely familiar with. So each tick represents usually a fixed amount of time. And then each tick, every agent runs its procedures. It might have a check that says, if this is true, run my stuff, and if not, don't run it, but it still has to do that check every tick. So in contrast, discrete event scheduling keeps a list of these time event combinations. And then as time advances, it executes each event as it reaches them, and also schedules new events as needed. And this can be combined with tick-based scheduling. So you can actually have a model that uses both. If some events only happen rarely, then you might want to schedule them using a discrete event scheduler. And if some events happen every tick, then you can just use normal tick-based. So that's what happens in this virus model. So here's the go procedure for the original tick-based version. We ask our turtles to get older, move. If they're sick, then you either recover or die. And then also, if sick, you can infect someone, and if not sick, reproduce. And then there's some updates. In the discrete event version, these two lines are gone because these getting older and recovering or dying are now being scheduled in the discrete event schedule instead of happening every tick. And I'll show how those look. And then we have this additional line from the time extension, which includes the discrete event scheduler to go until the current ticks value. So this is what the discrete event schedule actually looks like. So it looks like a list with the scheduled time here on the left, then which agent is going to do it in the middle, and then the event or action that the agent is going to execute, which is stored as an anonymous procedure. And so in this case, there's two different examples of getting older or recovering or dying. And so every time this time go until ticks line is called, what happens, let's say right now we're at tick 3, because let's say we were at tick 2 and then we ticked and now we're at tick 3. So now when this is called, we'd go through the schedule, say, oh, well, we're past tick 2, so let's execute this. And then we'd get to 9 and say, oh, we're not up to that time yet, and so this one wouldn't get executed yet. And then as the ticks advance, once we got up to tick 9, then when this command is run, we would execute that command. Yeah. Okay, so a couple other procedures, then I'll show the model running, although it looks pretty much the same when it's running as the old version, so it's not so exciting. But a couple, getting a little bit more into the code. So again, here's the original to infect procedure. So the turtle asks the other turtles that are here on the same patch who are not sick and not immune, if with some random probability to get sick. And in the discrete events version, we're again asking other turtles here that are susceptible. In this version, instead of having not sick and immune as separate variables, it was changed to just have a single status, which could be susceptible, immune, or sick or infected. Then we have the same random event where if that happens, we ask the person to get sick, but then we schedule an event for that other turtle to recover or die after this amount of ticks. So the current ticks plus some random duration of additional ticks that gets scheduled. And then this recover or die procedure, also with some random chance of recovery, the turtle becomes immune and then schedules an event to become susceptible again. So being in this model, becoming immune is only lasts for a certain amount of time. So they become immune and then they schedule this event to become susceptible again at some random time in the future, or otherwise they die. Whereas in this version, the original version, every tick the turtle has to check has my time of being sick gone longer than the sick duration? And if so, then do this random thing to become immune or to die. But this has to be checked every tick. Whereas here we just schedule this thing once, and then when we reach that time, that event happens. So let me just show that running really quick. So yeah, so this is in the models library. If you just search for virus, there's the original virus model, and then there's this virus using discrete event simulator. And so the interface looks the same, model looks the same, but if you go to the code, you'll see that it's using the time extension and then all the code that I just showed, that in the go procedure, we have this go until ticks. Within the interface, if you want to see the schedule, you can ask the time extension to show you the schedule. What's in the event schedule with that command. Okay. All right, so a few advantages of the discrete event scheduling. It can be much faster if there are many events that don't happen every tick, then just scheduling them to happen once as opposed to having to check every tick can speed up the model. It also makes it easier to model systems that have components that operate on different timescales. So if you have a single model with different things happening at different timescales, being able to schedule them is easier than, again, otherwise, whatever the thing is happening on the longer timescale, every tick you would have to say has 1,000 ticks passed or whatever it is, and then have that component do its thing. Sometimes it's conceptually simpler to think in terms of scheduling events. And also, as Steve mentioned, you can incorporate time series data into ABMs. And so that's also part of this time extension. There's a date time format. And you can link this discrete event scheduler to a time series data. And so if you have exogenous data that you want to incorporate and have events happen in your model based on some time series data you have, then this makes it easy to do that. Yeah, this is what I just said. You can anchor the discrete event scheduler to date times and then schedule events from a time series. A few potential pitfalls. On the flip side, it can be conceptually trickier, I think, sometimes to use this type of scheduling. And it's also easy to make what you think is an equivalent model that isn't actually equivalent. So in this example, here's the original virus model. And here's the discrete event scheduler version. Pretty obvious that those time series look different, even though all the parameter settings were the same. I will note, though, that this version did not actually attempt to exactly replicate the tick-based version. The recovery and immunity timing is different. But if you didn't know that, looking at them, they look almost the same, but they're not actually the same. So if you're translating from a tick-based to a discrete event scheduler version, that's just something to keep in mind and to check. Like if you've already validated or verified your tick-based version, you definitely will have to do it again with your discrete event scheduler version to make sure it's still modeling what you think it is. In some ways, it might be easier. In this case, I actually think this version is probably a better model because people are recovering and recovering based on an exponential distribution of recovery times, which probably is more realistic actually than this model. So the really sharp oscillatory behavior here probably is actually an artifact of the tick-based scheduling that you probably wouldn't want. So in this case, this is probably actually better, but I just wanted to emphasize that it's easy to make things that look equivalent that aren't actually equivalent. Okay, so I'm on pause there again, and any questions or comments? And yeah, Steve, if you have anything to add, please chime in.
No, that was great. Thanks.
Okay, so next thing we're going to show is LevelsSpace. And how are we doing well on time? Okay, so LevelsSpace is an extension for NetLogo that allows you to run multiple models at once and have them interact in some way. So if you're thinking in levels and you have a multi-level complex system, this can actually make it a lot easier to model that simultaneously as opposed to trying to do it all in one model. And so I'm going to show a few examples of things that can be done with LevelsSpace. Let me share the screen here again. Okay, so these I decided to just do the ones that are in the models library, so you can check these out yourself. So this first example is combining a climate change model with a wolf sheep model. So when we click setup here, we get two NetLogo windows, which are both models in the models library, a climate change model and a wolf sheep predation model. And when you click go over here in the parent model, and I'll show what the code looks like in a second, these models are both running simultaneously. It's not obvious just looking at them how they're interacting, but I'll show in a second that they are interacting. So, and these are being run so that both models are visualized. You don't have to run the models being visualized, in which case they'll run headless in the background and they take a bit less memory. So looking at the code here in this parent model, so we're using the LevelsSpace extension here. And first we create the two models. So this is the command to create the climate change model. And we're storing that model as a variable here called climate change model so that we can refer to it more easily. But you always have a list of all of the LevelsSpace models in this LevelsSpace command. You can always get a list of all the models that are running. And then here we're creating this interactive model of the wolf sheep predation model. And then there's some other setup here that's setting up things in that model. So like in the climate change model, setting up, adding some clouds, adding some CO2, and then having the model go for a while to reach, I guess they wanted it to reach some point before having them interact. And then the way that they're interacting is here in the go procedure. So we're setting the new regrowth, the grass regrowth time in the wolf sheep model is being set based on the temperature in the climate change model. So that's how these are interacting. So this is getting the temperature from the climate change model. So it's a similar syntax here to getting a variable from an agent in NetLogo. In this case, we're getting a variable of an entire model. So this is a global variable in that model. And then we're setting this new regrowth time based on that. And then we ask the wolf sheep predation model. So again, here we're treating each model sort of as an agent. So we ask that model to set this global grass regrowth time to this new regrowth time, and then we just ask the models to go. So this is a basic example of how this works. And you can get some interesting coupling between the models. And you can, of course, if these models are running on different timescales, you could ask one of the models to go for multiple ticks for every time that the other model goes, if you want something like that to happen. So that is an example of sort of a multi-level model where the output of one model is being used as the input, as an input to another model. Another interesting way of using LevelsSpace to visualize multiple model runs. So in this case, the background, the base model is also the wolf sheep predation model. And we're running num models. I'm going to put this at 10 just to make it easier to see. So we're running 10 models at once. And then each of these turtles over here is setting its X and Y position based on the, oh wait, I had a new slightly edited version of this. 1 second. Here it is. So on the X, each of these turtles is setting its X position based on the sheep count in that model, and the Y position based on the wolf count. And so when you run these things, you see these turtles are wandering around showing the current sheep and wolf count values. And so we see that they're all following a sort of similar trajectory, but obviously with some differences. And then over here, we have a plot where we're showing the min count, the minimum number of wolves in any of these 10 models that are currently running, the maximum, etc. So this can be a way to get a more visual and intuitive understanding of sort of the range of behavior possibilities in your models by running a bunch of them simultaneously. And if you have some way of visualizing some important parameter, or not parameter, some important, emergent value in the model, then this can be a useful way to visualize a bunch of models at once without having to do a bunch of after the fact data analysis. And the last one, I unfortunately didn't get this model in time to actually be able to show it running. My lab mate sent it to me last night, but it turned out that it was not the right version. But 2 people in the lab recently made a very interesting model of vision evolution. And so the way they used BehaviorSpace here is each of these, they're not actually, the real thing they're modeling is not a fish exactly. I forget what it was, but each of these creatures, they're modeling the emergence of vision. And one of the theories of this is that, when you're underwater, you can't see very far. And so having really good vision isn't that valuable. And then having a powerful brain isn't that useful if you can't see much. And so there's this idea of this coevolution between vision and brain size. And so these creatures, when they go onto land, their vision suddenly, they're able to see further. And so then cognition might become more valuable compared to when they're in the water. And so the way that they modeled increased cognition is that each one of these creatures would spin up a little LevelsSpace model of just its immediate surroundings and simulate what would happen if I go this direction, what would happen if I go this direction, and the other fish are also doing that to decide which food to go after. So if there's another fish very close to that food, it's likely that you're not going to actually get that food if you go in that direction. And so the way they simulated increased cognition was just the number of simulations that each agent could run each tick, where they would just pick some random initial values of what direction the other fish are swimming in, and the number of simulations each one got to run was how they modeled increasing cognition. And so this model was actually popping up new LevelsSpace models, like potentially hundreds of them each tick. Each agent was simulating its local surrounding in order to make its decision of which direction to swim in. And then they were able to get this emergent coevolution of vision and cognition as these creatures adapted to being on land. So that was a neat example of using LevelsSpace. And another way that people have used it is also for cognition. You wouldn't have to use LevelsSpace for this, but it can make it easier, where each agent had a LevelsSpace model that was actually running the Python extension and was running a neural network for each agent making its own decision. And running each one of those in a LevelsSpace model was easier in that case than just doing it in the original model. All right, any questions or comments on LevelsSpace?
My attention may have wandered for a second, but I just want to understand how, okay, when the fish spin up a LevelsSpace model, is it that they're giving their parameters to a running model, simulating it and getting a response back, or are they actually instantiating a new model?
They basically
a new instance of the model.
Yeah, they basically instantiate a new instance, and I don't think it's not actually exactly the same model, but they're instantiating a new instance of a related model. They pass in the locations of the food and the fish within their vision radius, and then they run that newly instantiated model a few times, and whichever with, like, I think swimming in a new direction for each one of those, and then whichever direction gave them the highest expected output, that gets passed back to the main model, and the fish swims in that direction.
That's pretty cool. Wow, neat.
Okay, so the last thing, some of you have maybe used the JS extension. I think it was either last year or the year before, a bunch of improvements were made to the JS extension, so I thought I would show that briefly. I will say I'm not at all an expert in JS, so if I say something that's false, you can just let me know. But the basic idea of GIS, graphical information systems, so you can import and export real-world spatial data into your models. And one way to think about this GIS data is sort of as a big spreadsheet where you have location data, which can be as a point, a line, or a polygon, and then an associated location for whatever these things are, and then optional extra data about those locations. So as an example, you might have post offices modeled as points that have a location, and then maybe with extra data like the street address of the post office. You could imagine other things also, the size of the post office or other things that might matter. Or roads can be modeled as line segments with extra data, perhaps like the speed limit of those roads. And then you could use this data to make a model where cars can travel along those road routes and maybe only at up to the speed limit. So I'll show a couple examples again here. So this model is not actually in the models library, but if you go to the GIS extension GitHub repo, this is the model that the tutorial goes through on how to build. Whoops, I have to load the data sets first. So this is using an GIS data from airports, and also just drawing a map of the US on the background to make it easier to visualize. The map in this case, I don't think actually is functional in the model, but as the user, it makes it easier to understand what's going on. And then we have airplanes that are flying between these airports. And at some point, one of them is carrying an infected passenger from one airport to another. And then this is modeling how this disease is then spreading across the airport network. So I'll just very briefly look at some of the code. So we're using the JS extension here. Using the JS extension, you can load these data sets. So now we have this airport data set, and for each of the airports in that data set, we get this vector of features of that airport, which are used to set the location. Here we're getting the location from the centroid of the airport, the population, the names. So this is just using the JS data to set up the model. In this case, in this sample model, where the airport connectivity is not actually being taken from real world data, so they're just creating links with random other airports in the model. And then in this case also, the airports are just, the airplanes are just flying between the airports without actually at that point really having to use the JS data. So this is actually a quite simple example, but does illustrate some of what the JS example can do. And then in the models library, there's a couple other examples here that have buttons for like all the different things that the extension can do. So if you want to see the types of things that can happen, these models are a good resource where you can set up and then do things like draw all the cities that are in this data set, draw the rivers, or you can also have patches displaying things, like having the patches display these rivers instead of drawing them as lines, etc. So we don't have much time to go through this, but the tutorial for the JS extension is quite good, and these models in the models library also give a good sense of what the GIS extension can do. And like I said, I'm not an expert, but from talking with people who do use the JS extension, they've said that if you haven't used it in the past couple of years since the updates, I have been told that the updated version is significantly improved compared to the prior versions. Okay, yeah, I'll stop there also if there's any questions or comments on that, although this is the one I'm least likely to be able to answer questions about.
Yeah, Jacob, to me, it seems like the next thing on my wish list is something that's like a patch, but really is a polygon, which I've been able to fake by using a turtle at the centroid of a polygon. Is that on the wish list there?
Have you used the new JS extension?
I think so.
So I might be mistaken. I think that does exist in the latest JS extension.
Okay, I'll take a look.
I'm not positive, but I think it is. If not, then you should send us a message, because that is something that I think there would be interest in adding. All right, so just the last couple minutes, I'll mention a few other things. So one is the Python extension. This really opens up all sorts of possibilities because you can run Python in NetLogo. Here's just a quick illustration of what that looks like. You use the Python extension, and then you have to set up your Python, whichever version you're using, and then you can run things within Python, like importing libraries. You can set variables in the Python environment. So in this case, it's setting a variable called a Python variable called a based on the value of the NetLogo variable called a. And then you can run the result of something in Python And when you do run result, that returns the value. And so then you can set that NetLogo variable based on the output of something in Python. So in this case, it's using this math library to get the greatest common divisor of these numbers. So this is a simple example. I've used this, for example, to do random number generators that NetLogo doesn't have. So I had a model where I wanted to get random numbers from a beta distribution, which is not built into NetLogo. So I just used the Python extension to generate random numbers using a Python random number generator package. But people have also used it for much more advanced things like PyTorch, using PyTorch to make a neural network for each agent, and then passing values in from the world to those neural networks, computing something, and then getting the result back, and agents are acting based on the outputs of those neural networks. So anything you can do in Python, including advanced machine learning stuff, you can run using the Python extension and have agents do stuff based on that. And then there's a bunch of other extensions that there's more than this as well, which you can check out here. But just a few other ones I thought I would just mention that I think are important. Some questions have come up recently from people that weren't aware of these. The profiler is for testing models speed, so you can run your model and it tells you how long each of your procedures take to run. So if you're trying to make your model run faster, this is really useful. The random package, random extension gives a bunch of extra functionality for having agents do things based on like randomly weighting how likely an agent is to be asked to do something based on some value, things like that. It can be quite useful. There's a matrix extension. There's a table extension, which gives you a data structure that in other languages is often called a dictionary, but with key value pairs. That can be very useful for storing more structured data. And you also can read in JSON data now into the table extension. So if you have JSON data from somewhere that you want your agents to access, you can do that. Reading in CSVs, the time extension I mentioned. This palette extension is fairly new, and it lets you color things. It gives you more options for coloring things with transparency and stuff. So if you want to do more interesting visualizations, the palette extension is useful for that. And then you can always go to this list and see a bunch of more extensions, including both ones that are officially packaged with NetLogo and a bunch of community-made extensions that are not officially packaged, but you can download them and use them. So I think we're right at time, but I'm happy to stay around a few more minutes if people have questions or other comments.
Any questions?